Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2! It's a challenge, Kakarot!
Now that we have a firm grasp on how cancellation executions can be used to activate new techniques and overall combat maneuvers, we can now discuss the concept of the slingshot. If we were to consider how the dash can be cancelled with R2 to create the shift, this alone proves that new movement-based techniques can be performed within Tenkaichi 2 that were never considered for actual gameplay. Further exploration has brought the slingshot to the limelight. Simply put, while the dash can be cancelled into shift activation, a new technique can be performed through the cancellation of basic movement and attacks, which will furthermore be known as the spring. The initiating technique used for spring activation stems from charged jumping melee. The term slingshot is used to describe the overall technical execution from jump initiation to ground termination. Therefore, the spring is one of the most important parts of the technique, for it is the hidden mechanical factor that allows the technique to succeed. However, unlike the shift, the spring cannot be activated through R2 cancellation. When a player performs the charged jumping melee attack, this attack can be cancelled through natural cancellation, just like charged base melee and charged hooks. However, unlike the other natural cancels, the jumping cancel produces a force that can be transitioned into momentum for the spring. As the charged jumping melee attack holds priority over base melee, such transitional activation holds a higher success rate than that of the opponent who attempts to interrupt the action through offensive melee. While the shift builds its momentum from the activation of the cancelled dash, the spring builds its momentum from the charge meter when the jumping melee attack is being charged. The length of the spring produced will reflect the amount of power charged in the meter prior to cancellation. To see the spring in action, the player would perform a charged jumping melee attack and hold left or right. Just before the attack lands on the opponent, the player must cancel the attack with natural cancellation. If performed correctly, the attack will cancel and the player's character will spring into the desired direction. As one may calculate, an attack with low charge prior to cancellation will produce a spring with short distance coverage. An attack with a medium charge prior to cancellation will produce a spring with a greater distance coverage. I'm sure you get the point. Again, due to attack priority, an opponent must choose his options well when handling a slingshot, for a character that performs a charged melee attack cannot be stopped with base melee. Note of importance: the spring, if charged enough, will bring the player's character outside of the step-in barrier, immediately allowing Super Blast capability or any other tactics within the player's arsenal. However, as directional incorporation is not a necessity, a player can simply cancel into a neutral standing position, ensuring all technical access yet again. Now let's move to the Slingshot Switch. Once the player has a full grasp of the slingshot and the nature of the spring, he should know that the spring itself cannot be directionally manipulated beyond activation in the way the shift is manipulated. That being said, the amount of power presented in one's charged jumping melee may also be incorporated into another movement, similar to that of the lift strike switch. This type of switch will affect each character differently, so it is important to get to know the characters. To perform, one would cancel a nearly strong charged jumping melee attack into no directional incorporation. Then, once the attack is cancelled, the player would then hold left or right as one would with the lift strike switch. If performed correctly, and depending on the character, the charge will swing the player around the opponent to rear position. This is also useful, for as the charged attack holds priority over base melee, one could gain rear position by presenting an unstoppable attack as a transitional means for obtaining rear position. Now, one could also use an alternative method of reaching rear position through Slingshot Manipulation, which one might consider a secondary version of the Slingshot Switch. When one performs a spring, the spring itself can be cancelled with R2 cancellation. This does not produce the same type of shift that one might expect with R2 cancellation, but with the right control, one can use such spring cancellation to directionally manipulate the fall of the remaining movement for rear positioning. With this fall, the descent sweep is also available for incorporation. Challenging. Now that we have uncovered the potential of the Enigma Dash and the spring techniques, let us explore such technical potential further by incorporating both techniques into one motion. For this instance, we are merely experimenting with technical discoveries for fun. How one chooses to conduct such a technique in battle is upon the shoulders of the player himself. The following technique is performed more as a flashy display of technical control, reflecting the player's foresight of the opponent's attack, otherwise known as Yomi, for Super Blast or switch positioned counterattack. To perform the technique known as challenging, the player must begin positioned within the step-in barrier and in front of the opponent. He must then wait until the opponent is on the brink of melee initiation. Once this level of Yomi is established, the player must perform a backward Enigma dash. During this dash, the opponent will be executing his combo set. When the opponent is reaching the end of his combo set, the player must then immediately hold forward and press R1 to initiate the forward jump, at which time the player should also be charging his melee. If timed correctly, the player and the opponent will be charging their melee at the same time and reaching the point of release, assuming the opponent is choosing to charge his melee. Instead of releasing the charged melee, the player would then hold back or to the side and perform the spring to escape the targeted area of the opponent's melee release. As the opponent reaches the terminus of his attack, the player can immediately activate a Super Blast as the counter attack. Likewise, as the second technique involved in challenging is the Slingshot Switch is also available to escape the targeted area of the opponent's melee release. If, on the other hand, the opponent does not charge his melee, the player may still take damage as priority of charged melee does not ensure invincibility. Time for a disclaimer. As this technique is basically used as a flashy exhibition, I would recommend that we stick to what we know will work. Now that we know that the ground can act as a tool for canceling combos with Descent, we can use this cancellation technique to execute any melee-based attack we wish in accordance to the fighter's stance. However, as we are also using the ground and pound near ground level, this brings to mind what options are available when the player chooses to plant his character's feet during a ground and pound reset. Of course, planting the character's feet is not necessary when performing the ground and pound reset, but as this option opens doors for other ground-based techniques, it should always be ready for immediate consideration. If the player becomes practiced enough with the ground and pound and grounded recognition, this will allow a player to perform techniques such as jump attacks, aka jumping Ki Blast flurries, which also creates enough distance for the dashing Ki Blast flurry to once again close the distance, jumping melee, and yes, even slingshots. Therefore, while the player is granted a variety of melee options via ground and pound and natural cancellation, many other attacks that were once considered to be unavailable during combos are now allowed and incorporated into close proximity combat. To ensure as many options are available to the player, one must again consider the differences of each character and choose accordingly. A player that is ensured ground and pound availability would be the shorter character. However, to increase the likeliness that R2 cancellation will result with grounded acknowledgement, it would be best to choose a shorter character with a more slim margin of height difference. Again, this also relates to how the character's physical melee is performed, for some characters possess attacks that create a larger hover effect strictly on how the attack is performed. Next is the Recoil. Now, the grounded aspect of the advanced movement can be taken in a variety of directions, as previously described. However, once the player gets to the point that such movement becomes natural, it is time that he becomes comfortable in using such techniques for defensive purposes as well. Of course, the player is ultimately the one who chooses the correct form of defense for any given situation, but as we keep advancing, new options are becoming available for a variety of situations. When we first begin to understand the concepts of advanced ground movement, the shift comes into play. While we have already covered how a shift, transitioned from a neutral dash, activated outside of the step-in barrier can be directionally influenced to a reversal point, the recoil is based on a similar concept, but one in which the player will initiate a backward Enigma dash from within the step-in barrier to escape a charged melee attack, hook, or grab attempt, then hold forward while pressing R2 to cancel the dash and shift forward into the position of technical initiation. For this to work, the player must be very receptive of what the opponent is doing, for a misjudged recoil attempt may bring the player back into the step-in barrier prematurely, thus falling victim to the release of the charged melee or grab attempt. Additionally, the forward grounded shift can also carry a descending sweep, which we will call the recoil sweep. However, no matter which tactic the player chooses to use, it is also very important to remember that charged melee and grab attempts can also be cancelled via natural cancellation. Therefore, as well as the defensive teleportation, one must always be aware of what options the opponent has available. For this reason, one can always use the grounded switch in place of the base recoil, which we recognize as the Recoil Switch. This also may carry a descent sweep, aka Recoil Switch Sweep. It is important to note that as the recoil concept can be used for defensive purposes, the slingshot can also be used in the same fashion, which we call the Slingshot Recoil and Slingshot Recoil Switch, or S3 Recoil. This also carries a descent sweep, called the S3 Recoil Sweep. At this point, you as the player should be able to mix and match techniques in accordance to what you deem necessary, for grounded movement encourages endless potential exploration. Understanding that we are now using the transitional execution between levels of focal adherence for defensive purposes, this raises questions on what else can be brought to the surface in terms of manipulating the levels of focal adherence for offensive, defensive, and movement-based exploitation. So far, we have discovered what movements can be incorporated within the step-in barrier, be it the shift that acts within its own level of focal adherence through directional incorporation, or using the Enigma dash to activate the dash within the step-in barrier. To this effect, we are physically positioned within a barrier that binds the character to level 2 of focal adherence, yet we are in a physical state that allows movement reflective of level 1 of focal adherence. But if we are able to perform techniques to reflect level 1 of focal adherence in a position that binds the character to level 2 of focal adherence, might it be possible to perform techniques to reflect level 2 of focal adherence in a position that binds the character to level 1 of focal adherence? The answer is yes. However, while the viability of performing the dash within the step-in barrier for shift transitioning allows immediate advantage against the opponent, the viability of performing techniques that reflect level 2 of focal adherence within level 1 of focal adherence stems from the advancement of the opponent. As one can dash within the step-in barrier, one can also perform the backflip or back step, and even the sidestep when positioned in level 1 of focal adherence. Such ability must be initiated from within the step-in barrier and linked through supplementary movement. When positioned within the step-in barrier, a player knows that side and back dash activation will result with side and back stepping. If the player were to keep activating the back step in quick succession, supplementary linked back steps may be performed, even when the boundary of the step-in barrier is broken. This may be a good idea to create some distance, but it is important to remember that a dash is faster than a back step. Supplementary back steps may help create a distance, but the opponent's dash can close the distance faster. As we have already discussed, back steps, side steps, and step-ins can be used to transition the character into the counter stance. As each supplementary linked back step can also transition into a side step, the counter stance of both the back step and the side step is available. However, it is important to acknowledge that while supplementary back steps and side steps are available for linked activation, attempting to perform a linked step-in will result with reactivation of level 1 of focal adherence, displayed as a neutral dash. Therefore, the step-in itself is strictly tied in with the step-in barrier, and reflectively, so too is the counter stance activated by step-in transitioning. The viability of the counter stance is based on countering base melee. A charged melee or dashing melee attack will ignore the counter stance, which, up until the dash cancel, was the only viable option for the opponent. To this effect, performing supplementary backsteps to activate the counter stance from a distance would not be viable, as the approaching opponent would be carrying a dashing melee attack. However, if the opponent is advanced enough to cancel his or her dash into the fighting stance, this would indicate an opportunity to activate the counter stance via supplementary backsteps to intercept the opponent's dash cancel approach for base melee capitalization. So far, we have managed to uncover a new depth of technical ability through manipulating the laws of focal adherence. In a sense, we have acknowledged the concept of traditional zoning, incorporated strafe zoning, and now we have created new techniques and have broken through the limitations set by focal adherence to maneuver between its instilled levels. Due to this accomplishment, we have uncovered a new realm of zoning in which maneuvers that were not meant to be used are used for manipulating distances and 3D movement for gaining optimal positions. One might call this manual zoning. But we won't stop there. If you like what you've seen thus far, I'm sure you'll like what's coming up next. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will discuss free will. This is Zero Annihilated, and you are watching Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2 Evolution.